The double doors of Elysian Emporium whispered open, a silent invitation to a world draped in silk and scented with ambition. Elijah Vance stepped inside, the polished marble floor reflecting the soft glow of recessed lighting like a placid pool. He moved with a quiet confidence, a rhythm that spoke of a life lived with intention, a life where quality was appreciated, not flaunted. His tailored suit, a charcoal gray that hinted at midnight blue in the subdued light, wasn't a shout, but a carefully considered statement. It was the kind of suit that understood the language of power without needing to raise its voice. And yet, even as he crossed the threshold, a prickle of awareness, subtle as a change in air pressure, registered at the base of his neck. It was a feeling he knew well, a ghost in the machine of his everyday existence, the awareness of being seen, not just as a man, but as a black man in a space not always designed for him. He wasn't here to make a scene or to prove a point. Elijah was here for a simple, almost mundane reason, a gift. His niece Maya was turning 16 next week, and he wanted to find something truly special, something that whispered of sophistication and dreams, yet to bloom. Elysian Emporium, with its curated collection of luxury goods, seemed like the perfect hunting ground. He moved through the men's accessories section, his gaze drifting over handcrafted leather wallets, sleek watches nestled in velvet boxes, and silk ties that shimmered like captured rainbows. He ran a hand lightly over the smooth surface of a silver cufflinks case, the cool metal grounding him in the present moment. There was a quiet pleasure in simply being here, in appreciating the artistry and craftsmanship that went into each piece. It was a form of self-care, a small indulgence amidst the demands of his life as a lead architect at a burgeoning firm. He paused before a display of pens, each one a miniature sculpture of polished metal and gleaming lacquer. He picked up a fountain pen, its weight substantial in his hand, the nib delicate and precise. He imagined Maya, a bright spark of a girl with a passion for writing, using this pen to fill notebooks with her stories, her poems, her dreams taking shape on paper. A faint smile touched his lips. This could be it. Elysian Emporium, Houston's premier luxury department store, was a microcosm of the city itself. A blend of aspiration and affluence, of diverse faces navigating a landscape defined by both opportunity and subtle divisions. The store hummed with a low, constant thrum of hushed conversations, the soft rustle of shopping bags, and the discreet footsteps of impeccably dressed sales associates. The air was carefully climate-controlled, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible scent of expensive perfume and polished wood. Outside, the Houston sun beat down with its relentless intensity, but inside, it was a cool, curated oasis of calm and consumerism. The clientele was a mix: well-heeled professionals, tourists with bulging wallets, and the occasional celebrity hoping to browse incognito. There were families whispering excitedly over designer handbags, couples debating the merits of different diamond cuts, and solitary figures like Elijah, moving with a quiet purpose. Houston, a city built on oil and ambition, thrived on this kind of conspicuous consumption, on the unspoken language of status and success. But beneath the polished veneer, the city, like the store, was a complex tapestry woven with threads of race, class, and history, and those threads, sometimes frayed and sometimes taut, were always present, even if unseen. As Elijah considered the pen, a figure detached itself from the periphery of his vision. Officer David Miller, Elysian Emporium's security detail, stood near a pillar, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed. He was young, barely out of his 20s, with a uniform that seemed slightly too large for his frame, as if he were still growing into the role. His face was earnest, almost anxious, his eyes scanning the shoppers with an intensity that felt disproportionate to the relaxed atmosphere of the store. He was, in essence, the silent guardian, the unseen protector of this temple of luxury. Elijah registered him, as he registered all security personnel in public spaces. It was a practiced, almost subconscious scan, a part of navigating the world as a black man. He didn't dwell on it, turning his attention back to the pens. He picked up another, a sleek black one with gold trim, and tested its weight, the smooth barrel cool against his fingertips. He was lost in the moment, in the quiet contemplation of choosing the perfect gift, when he felt it again. That subtle prickle of awareness, now sharpened, more defined. He glanced up almost casually and met Officer Miller's gaze. The young security guard didn't flinch, didn't look away. His eyes, a startling shade of pale blue, were locked onto Elijah, unwavering, assessing. There was no warmth in them, no neutral observation, just a cold, appraising scrutiny that lingered a beat too long. Elijah held his gaze for a moment, a silent question in his eyes, before turning back to the pens. He chose the black and gold one, a decision made almost abruptly, as if to break free from the unseen tether of that unwavering stare. He placed the pen back in its display, a sudden unsettling feeling settling in his stomach. The pleasure of shopping had evaporated, replaced by a faint but unmistakable unease. He knew this feeling. He recognized it. It was the feeling of being watched, of being judged, of being prejudged, and he knew, with a weary certainty, that his shopping trip was about to take an unwelcome turn. The unease settled into Elijah like a low hum, vibrating just beneath the surface of his composure. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, but Officer Miller's gaze felt like a physical weight, pressing down on him. He moved to the wallets, pretending to browse, his fingers tracing the supple leather of a bifold. He knew he was being watched, could feel the invisible thread of Miller's attention pulling at him. It wasn't overt, not yet, but it was palpable. He glanced back again, this time more deliberately. Miller was still there, near the pillar, but now he was subtly closer, his body language less relaxed, more alert. His eyes, Elijah noticed, weren't just observing anymore. They were searching, as if looking for something specific, something incriminating. Elijah's internal monologue began, a familiar script he'd rehearsed countless times in similar situations. Just stay calm, don't react, don't give him anything. He knew from experience that any sign of defensiveness, any hint of anger, would be misconstrued, amplified, used as justification. He had learned to navigate these moments with a practiced stoicism, a carefully constructed shield of indifference. But beneath the surface, a quiet anger simmered. He was tired of this. Tired of being perpetually under suspicion. Tired of having his success, his style, his very presence interpreted as a threat. He picked up a wallet, examining the stitching, turning it over in his hands. He feigned interest, but his mind was racing. He could leave. Walk out now, and avoid the inevitable confrontation. But a stubborn pride held him rooted to the spot. He was a paying customer. He had a right to be here. He wasn't going to be driven out of a store because of someone's prejudiced assumptions. Why should I be the one to leave, he thought, the question hardening into resolve. He would stay. He would shop. He would not let this young, presumptuous guard dictate his actions. He moved on to the watches, stopping before a display of chronographs. He leaned in, studying the intricate dials, the gleaming metal bands. He was genuinely interested in watches, appreciating their blend of artistry and engineering. He was considering a new timepiece for himself, a small reward for closing a particularly challenging project. He reached out to touch the glass case, and in that moment, he felt a presence behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Officer Miller. The air around him shifted, became charged with a different energy. "Excuse me, sir." Miller's voice was young but deliberately authoritative, tinged with a slight tremor of nervous energy. Elijah turned slowly, deliberately meeting Miller's gaze directly. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Yes?" he said, his voice calm, even. Just making sure everything is all right, sir." Miller stammered slightly, his gaze flicking down to Elijah's hands, then back up, avoiding direct eye contact for more than a fleeting second. Elijah raised an eyebrow, a subtle gesture of skepticism. "Everything is perfectly all right," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I'm just browsing." Miller shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Of course, sir. We like to keep an eye on things." Make sure our customers are comfortable." His words sounded rehearsed, hollow, lacking genuine concern. Elijah held his gaze for another beat, letting the silence hang in the air. He saw the flicker of insecurity in Miller's eyes, the forced bravado that couldn't quite mask the underlying tension. He understood with a weary clarity what this was about. It wasn't about his comfort. It was about Miller's suspicion, fueled by something far deeper than just keeping an eye on things. "I appreciate your vigilance," Elijah said, the word laced with a subtle irony that was likely lost on Miller. He turned back to the watches, dismissing Miller with a silent gesture. He knew this wasn't over. He could feel Miller's presence still hovering behind him, a shadow clinging to his heels. He spent a few more minutes pretending to examine the watches, his mind now fully consumed by the encounter. He was no longer thinking about gifts or watches or shopping. He was thinking about Officer Miller, about the assumptions being made about him, about the inherent injustice of it all. He could feel his anger rising, a slow burn that threatened to erupt, but he tamped it down, forcing himself to remain calm, outwardly composed. He wouldn't give Miller the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He decided to leave. There was no point in staying. The pleasure of shopping was gone, replaced by a bitter taste of resentment. He turned and walked towards the exit. His stride measured, his head held high. He passed Officer Miller, who was still lingering nearby, and met his gaze one last time. There was something in Miller's eyes now, something beyond suspicion, something that felt almost accusatory. It was as if Elijah leaving, choosing to end the interaction, somehow confirmed Miller's preconceived notions. As Elijah reached the doors, he paused, taking a deep breath of the slightly less rarefied air near the entrance. He turned back just once and looked towards Officer Miller. Miller was watching him, still, his gaze unwavering, almost triumphant. Elijah held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked out of Elysian Emporium, leaving the scent of luxury and the weight of prejudice behind him. Outside, the Houston sun hit him with its full force, a jarring contrast to the cool, controlled environment of the store. He felt a wave of weariness wash over him, a bone-deep fatigue that went beyond just this one incident. It was the cumulative weight of countless similar encounters, the constant low-level hum of racial bias that permeated his life. He hailed a cab, climbed inside, and gave his address. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, he glanced back at Elysian Emporium, the gleaming facade now receding in the distance. He knew with a sinking feeling that this wasn't the end of it. He had a feeling that Officer Miller, in his misguided sense of duty, wouldn't let it go so easily. Inside Elysian Emporium, Officer David Miller watched Elijah Vance depart, a knot of satisfaction tightening in his chest. He had seen it, he had felt it. There was something off about that man. The way he was dressed, too flashy, too expensive for just browsing. The way he moved, too confident, too smooth. And those eyes, that direct, almost challenging gaze. It all added up. He had a gut feeling, a security guard's intuition honed by months on the job. This man was trouble. He replayed the interaction in his mind, searching for confirmation of his suspicions. The way Vance had avoided prolonged eye contact, the way he had abruptly decided to leave after Miller approached him. It was classic, evasive behavior. He had probably been spooked, realized he was being watched, and decided to cut his losses. Miller felt a surge of pride. He had done his job. He had deterred a potential thief, protected the store's valuable merchandise. He walked back to his post, near the pillar, his posture now straighter, his step more confident. He glanced around the store, his gaze sweeping over the remaining shoppers. He felt a sense of purpose, of responsibility. He was the guardian of this space, the protector of these expensive goods. He was making a difference. But beneath the surface of his self-congratulation, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout. Vance hadn't actually done anything. He hadn't touched anything he wasn't supposed to, hadn't made any suspicious moves. He had simply been shopping. And he was well-dressed, clearly someone who could afford to shop here. Was it possible he had been wrong? Had he misjudged the situation? He pushed the doubt aside. Gut feeling, intuition, those were important. In his line of work, you couldn't always rely on hard evidence. Sometimes you just had to trust your instincts, and his instincts were screaming that there was something wrong with Elijah Vance. He decided to review the security footage. It was standard procedure, especially after any potentially suspicious encounter. He headed to the security office, a small windowless room tucked away in the back of the store, dominated by a bank of monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout Elysian Emporium. Sarah Chen, the store's assistant manager, was already in the office reviewing paperwork at her desk. She looked up as Miller entered, her expression neutral, slightly tired. "Everything all right, David?" she asked, her voice calm, professional. "Yeah, just want to check the footage from the men's accessories section," Miller said, trying to sound casual, but a hint of urgency crept into his voice. "Had a guy in there who seemed a bit shifty." Sarah raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Shifty how?" Miller hesitated, unsure how to explain his suspicions without sounding prejudiced. "Just the way he was dressed, you know. Kinda flashy, and he was lingering a lot. Seemed nervous when I approached him." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Flashy clothes? David, this is Elysian Emporium. People come here to buy flashy clothes." Miller flushed, slightly, feeling defensive. "It's not just the clothes, Sarah. It's a feeling. You know how it is." Sarah sighed softly, a hint of weariness in her voice. "David, I understand being vigilant, but we have to be careful about making assumptions based on appearances. We can't profile people." "I'm not profiling," Miller insisted, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just doing my job. I'm just being observant." "Okay, let's take a look at the footage," Sarah said, her tone conciliatory, but still tinged with skepticism. She gestured to the monitors. "Which camera angle?" Miller pointed to a screen showing the men's accessories section, zoomed in on the area near the watches. Sarah navigated the system, pulling up the footage from the last hour. They watched in silence as Elijah Vance entered the store, browsed the displays, and interacted with Officer Miller. As they watched, Sarah's initial skepticism began to solidify into something else. She watched Elijah's calm demeanor, his genuine interest in the merchandise, his polite but reserved interaction with Miller, and then she watched Miller's behavior, the lingering gaze, the approaching stance, the accusatory question. On the cold, objective footage, Miller's actions looked less like vigilance and more like harassment. She paused the footage, rewinding to the moment Miller approached Elijah. "Look at this, David," she said, her voice now sharper, more serious. "Watch your body language. You're practically looming over him. And listen to your tone of voice. It's confrontational, not helpful." Miller watched the footage, his initial confidence starting to crumble. He saw himself on the screen, his posture rigid, his expression tight. He heard his own voice, sounding strained and accusatory. He saw Elijah's reaction, the initial calm, then the subtle shift to weariness, and finally, the dignified retreat. On the screen, it looked bad. It looked like he had targeted this man, based on nothing more than his appearance. "But he looked suspicious," Miller mumbled, his voice now barely a whisper. "He just felt off." Sarah sighed again, running a hand through her hair. "David, feeling off is not a reason to accost a customer. We need concrete evidence, not gut feelings. And frankly, on this footage, it looks like you were the one acting suspiciously." Miller stared at the screen, his face pale, his stomach churning. He saw the truth staring back at him, reflected in the cold, unblinking eye of the security camera. He had been wrong. He had misjudged Elijah Vance, based on nothing but his own biases and assumptions. And now, the consequences of his misjudgment were starting to unfold. The seed of doubt had blossomed into a bitter, undeniable reality. He had not been vigilant, he had been prejudiced. And the truth captured on video for anyone to see, was about to cost him everything. The silence in the security office stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. Officer Miller stared at the monitor, the image of his younger self confronting Elijah Vance looping endlessly, a damning indictment of his own actions. Sarah Chen watched him, her expression a mixture of disappointment and concern. She had seen this kind of thing before, the subtle biases that could creep into even well-intentioned people's judgment, but seeing it so starkly, so undeniably, on the screen was still jarring. "David," Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm, breaking the oppressive silence. "You need to understand what this looks like. To anyone watching this, it looks like racial profiling. It looks like you targeted Mr. Vance simply because he is black and well-dressed." Miller flinched at the term, racial profiling. It sounded so harsh, so deliberate. He hadn't meant for it to be that way. He hadn't consciously thought, black man, therefore thief. It was just a feeling, a gut instinct. But as he replayed the footage in his mind, he couldn't deny the truth of Sarah's words. His suspicion had been triggered by Elijah's appearance, by his mighty clothes, by the unconscious biases he carried within him. I didn't mean to," Miller stammered, his voice barely audible. I thought he was suspicious. The way he looked around, the way he was dressed." He trailed off, realizing how weak, how flimsy his justification sounded, even to his own ears. "David?" Sarah interrupted, her tone now more direct. "It's not about what you meant to do. It's about what you did. You approached a customer. You made him feel unwelcome, based on nothing but your own assumptions. And that's not acceptable. Not in this store. Not anywhere." The weight of her words settled heavily on Miller. He knew she was right. He knew he had messed up. Badly. His initial surge of self-satisfaction, the feeling of having done his job well, had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, gnawing shame. He had wanted to be a good security guard, to be vigilant, to protect the store. But in his eagerness to prove himself, he had crossed a line. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and he had unfairly targeted an innocent man. What do I do?" Miller asked, his voice laced with desperation. He looked at Sarah, pleading for guidance, for a way out of this rapidly escalating situation. Sarah sighed, her expression softening slightly. She could see the genuine remorse in Miller's eyes, the dawning realization of the gravity of his mistake. He was young, inexperienced, and clearly had a lot to learn. But she also knew that this couldn't be swept under the rug. There had to be consequences. "First," Sarah said, her voice calm and measured, "we need to document this incident. I'm going to write a report, detailing what happened, based on the security footage and your account. And then, I'm going to have to show this to Mr. Thompson, the store manager." Miller's heart sank. Mr. Thompson. The store manager was a stickler for rules, for image, for avoiding any kind of negative publicity. This incident, especially if it was perceived as racial profiling, was exactly the kind of thing Mr. Thompson dreaded. He could already see his job, his fledgling career slipping through his fingers. "Mr. Thompson?" Miller whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Does he have to know?" Sarah looked at him, her expression firm. "David, yes, he has to know. This is a serious matter. We can't ignore it. We have to be transparent, and we have to take appropriate action." She paused, then added more gently, "This is also an opportunity for you to learn from this, David, to understand the impact of your actions, and to do better in the future." Miller nodded slowly, his head bowed. He knew she was right, but the prospect of facing Mr. Thompson, of admitting his mistake, filled him with dread. He knew Mr. Thompson wouldn't be understanding, wouldn't be forgiving. He would see this as a liability, a PR nightmare, and Miller would be the one to pay the price. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening, slightly. "It's Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice tight. "He wants to see me in his office. Immediately." She looked at Miller, a sense of urgency in her eyes. He must have heard something already. Someone must have seen or overheard something in the store, Panic flared in Miller's chest. He hadn't realized the situation was escalating so quickly. He had thought he could contain it, keep it within the security office, but now it was leaking out, spreading, threatening to engulf him. "Sarah, please," Miller pleaded, his voice desperate. "Don't tell him. Don't tell him everything. Maybe we can just handle it internally? I'll apologize to the guy if he comes back. I'll be more careful in the future. Please, just give me another chance." Sarah looked at him, her expression conflicted. She wanted to help him. She saw his remorse, but she also knew her own responsibilities. She couldn't cover this up, couldn't minimize the severity of the situation. "David, I can't promise anything," she said, her voice low. "But I'll try to explain the situation to emphasize that you're young and learning. But ultimately, it's Mr. Thompson's decision." She stood up, her movements brisk and purposeful. "Stay here," she said, her gaze meeting Miller's. "Wait for me, and be prepared for the worst." She turned and left the security office, leaving Miller alone with his fear and his shame, the looping footage on the monitor a constant, silent reminder of his mistake. Sarah walked quickly to Mr. Thompson's office, her mind racing, trying to formulate a strategy, a way to mitigate the damage. She knew Mr. Thompson's priorities: maintaining the store's reputation, avoiding controversy, maximizing profits. He wouldn't be interested in nuanced explanations or sympathetic portrayals. He would see this incident as a threat, a potential scandal, and he would react accordingly. She knocked on his door, and a gruff voice called out, "Come in." She entered the office, a large, imposing space furnished in dark wood and leather, reflecting Mr. Thompson's own personality. Stern, unyielding, and focused on control. Mr. Thompson sat behind his massive desk, his face grim, his eyes sharp and penetrating. He gestured for Sarah to sit, his movements curt and impatient. "Sarah," he began, his voice cold and formal. "I've received reports, disturbing reports, about an incident in the men's accessories section, involving one of our security guards and a customer." He paused, his gaze fixed on Sarah, demanding an explanation. "Tell me everything." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the difficult conversation ahead. She recounted the events of the afternoon, starting with Officer Miller's initial suspicion, his approach to Elijah Vance, and Vance's subsequent departure. She carefully avoided using the term racial profiling at first, focusing instead on Miller's overly aggressive approach and lack of professional judgment. She emphasized Miller's youth and inexperience, suggesting that this was a training issue, a mistake made in good faith, rather than a deliberate act of prejudice. Mr. Thompson listened in silence, his face impassive, giving nothing away. When Sarah finished her initial account, he leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. "And what exactly was it that made Officer Miller suspicious of this customer?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Sarah hesitated, knowing this was the crucial point, the moment of truth. She couldn't sugarcoat it, couldn't avoid the uncomfortable reality. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Officer Miller. He admits that his suspicion was based, at least in part, on the customer's appearance. He described the customer as being flashy and out of place." Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Appearance? What exactly do you mean by appearance?" Sarah took another deep breath. "Sir, the customer was African American, and he was well dressed. Officer Miller. He seems to have made assumptions based on the customer's race and his clothing." The word hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. "Race," Mr. Thompson repeated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if contemplating the implications of Sarah's words. The silence in the office became even more oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the store outside. Finally, Mr. Thompson spoke, his voice still cold but now tinged with a hint of anger. "Show me the footage," he commanded. "I want to see for myself what happened." Sarah nodded and quickly retrieved the security footage, pulling it up on the large monitor in Mr. Thompson's office. They watched in silence together, as the events of the afternoon unfolded again, this time under the harsh scrutiny of Mr. Thompson's judgment. Mr. Thompson watched intently, his gaze fixed on the screen, his expression hardening with each passing moment. He saw Elijah Vance enter the store, his confident stride, his impeccable attire. He saw Officer Miller's unwavering gaze, his increasingly intrusive behavior, his confrontational approach. He saw Elijah's dignified silence, his decision to leave without argument, his quiet retreat from the store. When the footage ended, Mr. Thompson turned to Sarah, his face now flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "Completely unacceptable. This is exactly the kind of thing we cannot tolerate. Racial profiling in my store? This is a disaster." Sarah braced herself for the storm she knew was coming. "Sir, I understand your concerns," she said, trying to remain calm and professional. "But I believe Officer Miller is young and inexperienced. He made a mistake. Perhaps with proper training and guidance." Mr. Thompson cut her off, his voice rising. "Training? Guidance? Sarah, this is not a training issue. This is a fundamental lack of judgment, a blatant disregard for our policies, for our values. This is about prejudice, pure and simple, and I will not tolerate prejudice in my store. Not from my employees, not from anyone." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Get Officer Miller in here," he barked, his voice booming through the office. "Now! I want to speak to him. Personally." Sarah nodded, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming. There would be no second chances, no opportunities for learning and growth. Mr. Thompson was in damage control mode, and Officer Miller was about to become collateral damage. She turned and left the office, walking back to the security room, the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on her. She found Miller still waiting, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Mr. Thompson wants to see you," Sarah said, her voice low and grave. "Now." Miller nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. He stood up, his movements stiff and mechanical. He knew this was it. His career at Elysian Emporium, his aspirations of being a security professional, were about to come crashing down around him. He followed Sarah out of the security office, walking towards Mr. Thompson's office like a condemned man walking to the gallows. As he entered the office, facing the wrath of Mr. Thompson, the truth was about to be fully revealed. Not just about his mistake, but about the devastating consequences of prejudice and misjudgment. The climax had arrived, and for Officer David Miller, it was about to be a catastrophic downfall.